Ladies and gentlemen,
Dr. Niels here.
Richard Gates. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Niels Harrit, and I'm a retired associate professor of chemistry from the Department of Chemistry in Copenhagen, where I've served as a scientist and a researcher for more than 40 years. And my presentation today will be very short. It was natural for Richard and I to divide this subject roughly into Richard has been doing the physics, and I'll be doing the chemistry. But there'll be some overlap, but the information which will overlap will be considered differently. That is, I'll view it from the chemist point of view, as Richard has done from the architect and engineering point of view. Now, so basically we'll be dealing with the issue of blowing up buildings. And ladies in the audience may be apologized here, because I know very well that it is a very boyish thing to blow up buildings. But if any of you gentlemen have an itch to become a blaster without joining the military, you may go into a website called How Stuff Works. And there you can read an interesting essay called How to Become a Blaster. The first thing you must do, obviously, is to achieve the architectural blueprints of the building. But demolition companies these days do not only limit themselves to that. They establish a virtual mathematical model of the building within the computer, not only to figure out what the loads are on the different elements of the building, but also because they can actually place charges within the structure in the computer and run the very critical time sequence of firing the charges in order to make the building go down the way it's supposed to go. But it's not only a matter of mathematics and calculations, it's very much a matter of experience. This profession is inherited in families very much like circus artists. We had recently in Copenhagen a major demolition, and this huge structure was taken down by a Scottish demolition company, and the guy was called Sinclair. I don't remember his first name, but he was sitting on national Danish television bragging that he was the fourth generation of this demolition dynasty, and I took my first building down at the age of 3. So this is very much a matter of how much should it take here? No, well, maybe a little more, and they go through the building many times. To take down a chimney, these people, this is kid stuff, or Boy Scout stuff. And gentlemen, if you had tried to take down a tree, you know that you cut it here in order to make it fall this way. But to take a larger structure into its own footprint is really an achievement which calls for our greatest respect. It's really a piece of art. And so there's only a small handful of international demolition companies which undertake such enterprises. And then they have used tools, and these tools are called explosives. Actually, ordinary gunpowder, as we all know, is an explosive. It was invented by the Chinese in the 10th century, many years ago. And dynamite was invented by Alfred Nobel in 1866. And this you can use for concrete. It is not used very commonly these days, but when you take down a concrete structure, it is ordinary, old-time explosives you use for that. But for steel, you need some more sophisticated stuff. So the chemists have developed a whole range of what we call molecular explosives. And you can get them for any purpose. Some are very fast, some are very slow, some are pretty silent, and some makes a hell of a lot of noise. The most popular explosive for steel goes under the trade name of RDX. And here you see the chemical structure of this material, and it's called cyclotrimethylene trinitramine. And if any is in need of a short crash course in chemistry, I will be happy to give it afterwards and explain to you why this is particularly nasty, because it is. You can see that actually the burning front is moving about 20 times the speed of sound. So the bang is actually going through the sound barrier. It makes a hell of a lot of noise. But it's fairly cheap, and it is amazingly efficient. Here you see two demolition workers mounting what they call a beam cutter of RDX. And see how small it is. At this point, it's important for you to realize that an explosive is a chemical reaction in which a gas is developed very quickly, so you get a very high pressure very quickly. So an explosive is knocking things apart. It's a mechanical force which takes things apart. And this is what this beam cutter is supposed to do. You're supposed to knock over this column. And please notice that they have mounted the beam cutter at an angle of 45 degrees. For that obvious purpose that the column is supposed to slide off once they have knocked it over. If they didn't, if they had cut it horizontally, it would just sit there and stick there, and nothing more will happen. And if they have 4 columns side by side, they will take them all 4 out at a time, so actually the whole structure moves, slides off in order to get down. And then some people have noticed that underground zero, you see here to left, there are actually steel beams which have been cut in this steel columns which have been cut in this very characteristic manner. And this picture is controversial. Some people claim that it has been taken down by what you call it, a heat cutter, how you would cut steel. I missed the English word here, but how you can cut steel in a more civilized manner. There are many reasons why this is not the case, but I'll refrain from going through that. Only to notice that these two gentlemen standing here in the front are obviously firefighters. And 338 firefighters were killed during the collapse of the Twin Towers. And the remaining surviving firefighters were permitted to go and look for the remains of their dead colleagues up until September the 29th. So this picture must be taken very early after 9/11. And they waited to bring in the big machines until they gave up. I will not say anything more than that. Another thing to realize about explosives, due to the pressure an explosive can do, it can do work. Explosives can move things. And to illustrate that, I have a little video here which I love a lot. This is a German chemistry class, and they have made ordinary gunpowder. And they have loaded the gun with a potato. What a release. Maybe we should have a little more sound on that. Nevertheless, now you have learned that explosives can do work. And then I will show you a video by David Chandler. He has already been presented here. But this time, we'll see the North Tower exploding, not all of it. But it's a small fraction of the collapse of the North Tower. And Chandler, who is retired as well, but he was a wonderful teacher, is moving our attention on different aspects of what we are seeing. I'll cut it off very early once we have learned the lesson. But before I started, I want to bring in actually our prime witness, Sir Isaac Newton. And his tomb is standing not very far from here. I don't know how far it is actually, in Westminster Abbey. And he he published the most important book in natural science in 1687. And it is called Principia Mathematica Philosophiae Naturalis, and that was supposed to be Latin. I can't read it myself, it's very thick, but I know that it contains the 3 laws of Newton of motion, according to Isaac Newton. And the only thing we've already heard about, the 3rd law, action equals reaction. I wish to bring in the 1st law now before I start this video. And it is, Newton's 1st law says that an object moves in the direction of the force. It's very simple. If you push a trolley, it goes that way. If you pull a trolley, it goes this way. Now, the funny thing with gravity, and I will take Richard's remote control. The funny thing with gravity is it moves this way. Okay? So according to Sir Isaac Newton, gravity can never make a thing goes this way. This is so basic. We're digging into the very fundamentals of science. Here is David Chandler. 1, 2.
The starting point in science is observation. What you are seeing here is what happened to the North Tower of the World Trade Center, second of 3 buildings to collapse on 9/11/2001. I use the word collapse, but words can be deceptive. What do you really see happening here? There's a tremendous amount of falling debris, but under the canopy of debris, do you see the rapid sequence of explosive ejections of material? Some of the jets have been clocked at over 100 miles per hour. I will call them explosions because it's hard to find other words that describe what we are seeing here. The explosions are not isolated and few. They are continuous and widespread. They move progressively down the faces of the building, keeping pace with the falling debris. Perhaps you can imagine a natural cause. I can't. Notice that the explosions are occurring on multiple floors at once, over a wide zone, not in a floor-by-floor sequence that might be explained by pancaking collapse. Notice there are explosions far below the point of collapse. Some are isolated and focused. These are often referred to as squibs and are commonly seen in controlled demolitions. However, this is not a standard controlled demolition. The building is being progressively destroyed from the top down by waves of explosions, creating a huge debris field. The destruction is in waves, not just in one wave. Most obvious is a rapid sequence of explosions near the visible corner of the building. But simultaneously, we can see another wave of explosions much further down the face of the building under the canopy of falling debris. Notice that both waves of explosions progress down the face of the building, nearly keeping pace with the falling debris just a few feet away. Slabs of concrete did not fall to the ground and smash to dust. There is almost no concrete in the rubble pile. Notice that the concrete is being forcefully ejected outward from the sides of the building, already pulverized to dust. Notice that embedded in the dust clouds are huge girders and entire sections of steel framing that are being hurled out of the building. The horizontal speed of some of the girders has been clocked at over 70 miles per hour. Some of these girders impale themselves in the sides of neighboring buildings. Some landed as much as 2 football fields away from.
Explosives can do work. And this is enormous forces we're seeing at display here. Somebody has estimated that this steel beam should be 20 tons. It's a bit too much. Well, let's say 15 tons, 14 tons, which is being thrown 100 meters and going like a spike into a building across the street. Here we are 200 meters, 600 feet from the North Tower, and these are fragments about the size of 4 tons being thrown out horizontally. Game is over here, according to Isaac Newton. Now, I'll show you some other observations. We are here at the South Tower, minutes before collapse of the South Tower. In the corner, diagonally from, we don't need the sound, from the airliner impact, and we'll see a metal or something is pouring out of the South Tower here. These, of course, are amateur videos, and it's not the best quality in the world, but there's something pouring out of the South Tower corner here. There are 3 amateur videos of this. This is another one, and there's no sound on this one. I can talk over it. What we see pouring out here looks very much like a molten metal, and we can all see that it is orange. And the next one is the same place, and I keep it in because it looks like the building actually is breaking in a little while. There's a big blurb coming out now. Whoa! A little after blurb, as we say. So there's something pouring out of the South Tower prior to collapse. And underneath this corner, which is the corner where the biggest column is, you can see the stuff falling down, and you see these squibs also coming out. It's the same area of the building, the corner of the south building here. And there's a bigger one higher up here. This is a close-up. And this observation actually is recognized by NIST. This National Institute of Standards and Technology, this picture is taken from the NIST report. And they acknowledge that whatever is pouring down the South Tower had an orange glow, which is important because it means that it is not, you say, aluminium around here in England. So, because molten aluminium is silvery white. Aluminium melts at 660 degrees centigrade, and that temperature you can easily achieve in an ordinary office fire. But molten aluminium is white. You see in this experiment where the experimentalist has molten aluminium, and it's running down this rusty steel beam here, and nothing happens, by the way. So it's not aluminium. There's not very much copper in the building. Believe me, this is not gold. There's only one metal which can account for this observation, and that is iron. But the problem here is that iron melts at 1538 degrees centigrade, which is beyond reach of any office fire. No matter how much you pour in of jet fuel, you'll never come up to the melting point of iron and steel, because steel are iron alloys. So there's only one chemical reaction which can account for this observation. It is called thermite. And this is not an African insect with six legs. It is a chemical reaction which was published by a German chemist called Hans Goldschmidt in 1893. He published that if you take finely pulverized aluminium and mix it with, this chemical formula is iron oxide. If Fe means iron, but if any one of you has problems with this, we may call it rust. There are many different kinds of iron oxide, and one of them is rust. So if you want to call it rust, let's say it's rust. It will work the same. You take pulverized aluminium, and you take pulverized rust. You mix these two powders. If you can make them react, which is not easy, but if you kick it, it will react, and you'll form elementary iron and aluminum oxide. And you'll notice that the oxygen has moved from the iron to the aluminum, because aluminum has higher affinity for oxygen. But the molten iron coming out of it has a temperature of 250 degrees centigrade, which is very, very hot. It's a very useful reaction. It can be used for welding. It was patented by Goldschmidt in 1898 and used for the first time in 1899 in the German city of Essen for welding tram rails. And all the rails lying on the American prairie or the northern Sweden are welded together by this thermite welding. But because the iron coming out of this reaction has this ridiculous high temperature, 1,000 degrees above the melting point of steel, it can be used for destroying steel structures, armor. So for that reason, the thermite reaction in many different varieties have been used for military purposes since the First World War, in bombs and in torpedoes. So when you see a torpedo blasting its way through the side of a German's Panzerkreuzer, Gneisenau, it is not actually blowing its way, it's burning its way through the ship. The classical thermite is not an explosive. It is destroying things by means of heat, while a genuine explosive is destroying things by means of force. So now I'll show you what thermite can do to a French car.
This is thermite. It's a powdered mixture of iron oxide and aluminium, which when ignited burns at 2,500 degrees Celsius, which is very, very hot. This is a car. It's been specially chosen to be destroyed because it's old, it's white, but more importantly, because it's French. The engine block is the densest part of a car. It's basically a huge lump of metal, and, well, it's very hard to melt. Lucky then, the Brainiacs have plenty of thermite, specially packed into the slow-release mechanism of a garden flower pot. A big pile on the bonnet directly over the engine block should do the trick. Time to light the fuse and give this homage to French engineering the send-off it so richly deserves. The irreversible thermite reaction begins. Within seconds, the fiery concoction eats through the bonnet, spraying molten thermite into the engine beneath. The devastation continues inside until finally a torrent of white-hot liquid metal pours out of the bottom, signaling the inevitable victory for Thermite. A quick check confirms a clear path of destruction through the engine.
Yeah, the poor French cars. I've given this presentation also to French-speaking audience, and they didn't find it funny at all. Maybe some of you think, don't we have a problem here? If Niels is in the process of trying to persuade us that thermite can be used for cutting steel columns, don't we have a problem here? Because what you see on the French car is that the molten iron coming down through the flower pot is going down vertically. How can you ever cut anything which is vertical already? Like these are steel columns. That problem obviously has been solved, because otherwise you couldn't use it for military purposes. What you have to do is you have to put the thermite into a container. You must, of course, be able to stand the heat, and then just leave an opening, and the thermite would find its own way out. I'll show you an advertisement for a nice little device, which is ideal for awesome if any of you is in need of getting rid of the summer house while you're on vacation on the Canaries. This is the way to do. You can buy this stuff. But it's a very short advertisement, and it's not on the web anymore. So I'll just prepare you for what you're going to see, otherwise you may miss it. You'll see this device mounted horizontally. You'll see wires coming up from it, and you can control it remotely by your cell phone or whatever you use. And in front of it, there's a little steel stick, and let's see what the thermite can do. Yeah, that's it. That's what it's called a cutter charge. So that is what thermite can do to a steel beam. There are many observations. I'll not present all of them, just 2 or 3 of them. Each on their own implying the thermite was also used for the demolition of World Trade Center. One is molten iron in the rubble on ground zero. This picture was taken 8 weeks after 9/11. And this grab, when they dig down into the rubble, you'll see it's molten iron actually coming up here. It's red glowing, hot molten iron. And all the witnesses, I've counted 23, but there are many more probably. They would tell us that if they pulled up a steel beam like this one, it might be red glowing in the end and actually dripping with molten steel. Other workers talked about molten pools of molten. They didn't know it was iron. So some of them are saying molten metal, or some of them are saying molten steel, but it is molten iron from the thermite reaction. And so pools of molten metal, streams of molten steel. You see when they're digging down. This is the thermite reaction which is just left in there to ensure that you're still thinking accordingly in the proper directions. This picture I can't leave out really. It must be, I don't know when it's taken, but it must be pretty late in the cleaning up process. You can see how far they've gone down here, and you can also see how you cut steel columns when you're doing civilized. But what's happening in here? It looks like a blast furnace from my childhood's geography books. And notice from now on that whenever we see this, the smoke coming out from whatever is happening is white. This is the thermal map of ground zero. NASA, which is another institution in America we are all familiar with, took an airplane and flew over ground zero with an infrared sensitive camera on board. And they could measure the temperature directly in the surface. So what you see here to your left is the thermal map of ground zero. And the temperature, so you have the North Tower here, you have the South Tower here, and you have 7 up here. And the color codes here corresponds to, under the North Tower, they measure a temperature of 750 degrees centigrade. And under building 7, they report a temperature of 730 degrees centigrade. And this is from September the 16th, 5 days after 9/11. And in the days before that, it had been raining. And particularly on September the 14th, it has been pouring down. What you British call raining cats and dogs. And still, they measure temperature which is at least 100 degrees above what you can achieve in an ordinary office fire. A couple of days later, it had cooled off, but what you see when you dig down in the rubble, there is molten iron down there. This is, many witnesses are calling this of course you do not see that after ordinary fires, but it's completely denied from the official authorities. NIST simply said, this hasn't happened, we haven't seen it. I call ground zero the longest smoking gun in history. Officially, the fires weren't put out until December the 20th. Okay, more than 3 months it took them to put out these fires. And this is very unusual. And they did what they could. They poured on millions of gallons in water. Hudson River was pretty close. They used a synthetic, extinguisher called pyrocool. They simply couldn't put a lid on whatever was happening here. It would not be correct to call it a fire because it was actually going on underwater even. We have ideas about what was happening here in terms of chemistry, but we still have some unexplained observations. But definitely, this was not ordinary fires. Actually, things were happening far into February, I promise you. The other evidence I wish to present to you comes from the World Trade Center dust. As Richard already has explained, everything was pulverized. A total volume of 500,000 tons of pulverized World Trade Center was distributed over lower Manhattan, and a big chunk of it probably was thrown into the Hudson River. And this dust was subject of some very early reports. The first one came from a private company called the R.J. Lee Group in 2003, and they came with a follow-up in May 2004. United States Geological Survey came also with a description of what was in this dust in 2005. And based on these very early reports, there was an American physicist called Stephen Earl Jones from Brigham Young University who read these reports. And already, they're pretty good reports, actually. And from their description of the World Trade Center dust, he concluded that locally, the steel as such was not heated up beyond 250 degrees centigrade. But locally, there were extremely high temperatures, probably beyond 3,000 degrees centigrade. So at some point, he decided that we have to take a look at the dust. But he didn't have any samples. So he sent out he asked the public for anybody who were having dust samples, please come forward with them. And I'll tell you a story about a woman who's called Janet McKinley. She lived on the corner of Cedar Street and Liberty Street on the 4th floor of this building here. And she actually had a view of the plaza. So when the South Tower came down, she ran like crazy with a wet towel around her head, which was very cleverly done. And after a week, she was permitted to come back to her apartment, and this is what it looked like here to your left, upper left. She's dead now. She died from a brain tumor about 3 years ago, which many people, including herself, ascribed to whatever she was exposed to here. And she was a wonderful woman with an artistic mind, and she understood the apocalyptic aspects of what she accidentally had been neighboring. So she put some of the dust aside, intending to use it for some artistic work, which she did. I will not have time to show it, but she stored it in a cool and dry place, which we, the scientists, eventually was very happy about. So the first dust Stephen E. Jones got from Janet McKinley, and he put it under his electron microscope, and you see this to your left. Some of the particles here in the World Trade Center dust looks like what it's supposed to look like. They are irregular. This is crushed concrete. But some of the particles are completely round, small spheres. And you see a close-up of one of these spheres here. And if you take a plastic bag of this dust and you pull the magnet along the plastic bag, this is the belly of Professor Jones. He has a very strong magnet. He's pulling it along the plastic bag. Something comes along with the magnet, quite a lot actually. And what comes along, most of what comes along with the magnet are these small iron spheres. So it's iron. When it comes along with the magnet, it is iron. So these small spheres are iron, but how can an iron particle be completely spherical? There's only one explanation for this, and this is that earlier in its thermal history, it has been a liquid and not flying, because liquids has something called surface tension, meaning that a flying droplet automatically becomes completely round. If you take a close-up through a microscope of mist, you'll see the droplets being completely round, and the same goes for the fat particles in your skimmed milk. They're completely round, same phenomenon. So this iron must have been a liquid and not flying. So Jones thought, aha, thermite. So he bought thermite. You can buy this mixture you saw on the French car. You can buy it on the web. I will not suggest you to go home and play with it in your back garden. This is serious stuff. But Jones still is a professional. So he's burning a portion of thermite in his laboratory, which you see here, and it is sputtering and burning like on the French car. Before proceeding, please notice the little white cloud up here. This is the other product of the thermite reaction, aluminum oxide. But when everything has cooled off, Jones took the remains, the ashes, from the commercial thermite, and this is the stuff you see to your left. And to your right is the same picture I showed you before from the World Trade Center dust. And you'll recognize the same spherical particles here as you see over there. Now, how can we know that this is the same material? Then I have to bother you with a technology called energy dispersive spectroscopy, which means that within the electron microscope, you can direct the electron beam at a specific point. And we can do that with an accuracy better than 1/10,000th of a millimeter. We can hit a specific spot. And the material responds by sending out X-rays. And these X-rays can be analyzed in a spectrum. And this is what you see below. Each line corresponds to an element. So we get information of which elements are present at the spot where the electron beam hit. And Fe means iron. Ca means calcium, K means potassium, Si is silicon, Al aluminum, and magnesium. And you'll find exactly the same elements over here. You'll find iron, you'll find, this is a bit, or am I getting older? I believe this is calcium, potassium, silicon, aluminum, and magnesium. So this is a fingerprint. This is the same material in the World Trade Center dust as you find from burning, firing the commercial thermite. Now, if there are anybody here with particular interest in this, I will not refrain from pointing out that there are two spikes here which differs. There's one here, Ti means titanium. This is white paint. I'll guess that all the white paint you see in here is titanium dioxide. This is what you use for almost all white paint. So it's contamination on the surface of the World Trade Center spheres by white paint. And this one down here, S, is sulfur. It comes from wallboard or gypsum. The formula for gypsum is calcium sulfate, means that it contains calcium and sulfur. And gentlemen, we all know that how wallboard is a wonderful material. You can saw through it, you can hammer spikes against it, and it's eminent for fireproofing. You were not allowed to bring any combustible material into World Trade Center. Well, people were allowed to wear clothes, and they were eventually allowed to bring papers to their offices. I do not know if actually wooden furniture was allowed in the offices, but beyond that, there was absolutely no combustible material in World Trade Center. So all the walls were done with wallboard, and the whole core of the Twin Towers were simply packed in wallboard. So this is pulverized gypsum, which is contaminating the surface of these spheres. Am I going over time? I probably am. Nevertheless, the last proof of thermite being, is also coming from Professor Jones, because when you have a violent event like an explosion, there's always something left. And the police will come and always find some remaining explosives. And they can always identify which explosives was used. Actually, according to law, you have to add to every explosive being produced a ceramic tag. So the police can actually not only identify the nature of the explosives, they can actually identify the very batch where these explosives were manufactured. But it doesn't count for thermite. So this may be one reason why we have a problem here. But Jones looked into the dust, and what he found, this is late 2007, he found what we call some red-gray chips. This is the biggest one ever found. It's really a biggie. It's 2 millimeters long, and it's the red side of these chips which is interesting. Red, rust is red, okay, iron oxide. And most of them are much smaller than that. This is an electron microscope picture of such a chip. And this bar down here is 1/10 of a millimeter. So this is the thickness of this stuff. It takes a microscope to look at them, and you actually have to practice a bit in order to be able to find them. But nevertheless, Jones presented this in December of 2007 in Boston, and in early 2008, a team of scientists was assembled, and yours sincerely was invited on board. I was quite honored at the time of being so, and volunteered. And it resulted 18 months later in a publication which came on April the 3rd, 2009. And you see here where I eventually ended up as the first author. It's very long, and there's a lot of information in it. I will not bother you with that. Only the single most important qualitative discovery that we did was that these chips were still reactive. Meaning that when you heat them up, they react. This was unreacted material. And it's difficult to illustrate. I'll try nevertheless. In this experiment, the experimentalist, who is one of Professor Jones' assistants, he is carrying a microtorch in his right hand, and to the left of the flame is one of these less than a millimeter long red-gray chips. And he's moving the torch from the right to the left. And the second it hits, you see there's a white, something is coming out from the chip. It's an explosive reaction. Actually was a particle coming up, and he could feel that something hit his hand, but unfortunately he couldn't find that specific particle from that specific experiment. So something is going on. This is definitely not ordinary paint acting in this way. The next little film I'll show you is not done by us. It's an independent worker called Mark Basil. But he took one of these red-grade chips and put it on what you may compare with a hot plate. But it's all under a microscope, so it's very small. And you'll see how it behaves when you heat it up. Here it's lying on this hot plate. Of course, it's the red part of it which is interesting. And upon reaching a certain temperature, you see the chip is swelling, so a gas is being formed, and you see this light phenomenon moving through the chip. What you do in science when you have these ridiculously small items, you put in an instrument which is called a differential scaling calorimeter, which can measure the heat being developed when the reaction occurs. So we put the chip into this instrument, we heat it up 100 degrees, 200 degrees, 300 degrees, 400 degrees, and then at 430 degrees, boom, it simply goes off scale. So something is happening. And we are taking out the chip from this instrument, and all the pictures you see to your left here have been subjected to this treatment. It has been taken out from the differential scanning calorimeter, and you recognize formation of these metallic spheres. And this is iron. I'll not show you how we'll use the energy dispersion spectroscopy to prove this. So it forms elemental iron, which is the unambiguous proof that this is a thermitic reaction. But it has not much to do with what you saw on the French car. It's very far from Hans Goldschmidt's Thermite. At that time, you were making mixtures just by adding the components together. We call that top-down procedure. But during the 80s, there became a new, fundamentally different way of making stuff called nanotechnology. And in nanotechnology, you build materials from the bottom up, from the atomic and molecular level, which has the advantage of all things are being much smaller, much closer, reacts much faster, and you can embed the whole thing in a plastic, so it's much easier to move around. We know that the military laboratories have worked on these materials since the 1990s, and now it's being used. They have programs for this all over. In particular, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory were pioneering this research. And my colleagues at the military research institutions, they also have to brag once in a while, and they're applying for funding, and they're giving presentations at conferences. So we completely understand the technology. We know how to make this kind of stuff. We cannot reproduce exactly the same material we have found in the red-grade chips. But they have actually published recipes of how to do this. So what you see here on your right is my colleague, Kevin Ryan, one of the other authors from this publication I showed you before, who has made nanothermite in his backyard and firing it off. So this is our homemade, we call it nanothermite. Nanothermite being fired in his backyard, and you recognize the formation of exactly the same metallic spheres here, and then we can use this technology I just described for you to demonstrate that this is exactly the same material which is being produced during ignition of the chips from the World Trade Center dust. Now, okay, I should mention this. This is a lucky find. We were very happy when we found this because this is a half-burned chip. Very lucky, because it shows you unambiguously where the iron spheres are coming from, because it's still sticking to the chip, okay? This is a chip which was burned in the laboratory. It's not completely round because it cools off so fast, very fast. But the one to your left had been in a hotter environment once it was formed. Now, the end of my presentation here, I return to the Twin Towers, and within 5-7 minutes, I'll present to you a consistent collapse model for the Twin Towers. That is what you'll learn in 7 minutes, will be without internal, it will be consistent. And you'll understand why I have to tell you the nanothermite story first. The report from National Institute of Standards and Technology on the Twin Towers came in 2005. 14,000 pages. This is a strategy which is certainly also used around here. The Americans call it tin rat, and it means they ain't never gonna read all that. And true enough, believe me, most of it is hot meat, hot air, and dead meat. You're not supposed to read 14,000 pages. What you do read, well, the specialists can go into the appendices. Sure, we do. But what you read is the main summary, 475 pages. It is readable if you're into that kind of stuff at all. So you start reading, and you come to chapter 6. Chapter 6 is called the probable collapse sequence. And then you think, now we are going to hear how the World Trade Center Twin Towers collapsed. And you start reading. And after a while, you realize that there's nothing about the collapse in here. And then you come to page 82 and footnote number 13. And this is the most important footnote, in my opinion, after World War II. But it has been authored in such a way that I will not refrain from calling it academic terror. It took me 2 or 3 times, read it again and again, to really appreciate what is in here, and I'm trained. So let's give it a try, okay? The focus of the investigation. This is a footnote. The focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse for each tower. Their timeline goes from when the airliner impacts, goes into the building, and to the beginning of the collapse. Maybe we should read the first sentence again. The focus of the investigation was on the sequence of the events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse for each tower. For brevity in this report, as Winnie the Pooh would have written, for brevity in this report, this sequence is referred to as the probable collapse sequence, although it does not actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached and collapse became inevitable. This means that there is no official account for the collapse of the Twin Towers. Believe me or not? No, believe me. There is no technical account. So, we're free. And Richard has already told you about the pile driver theory. So I will not go into details about that. But it tells you, quite briefly, that 2 or 3 stories here are being compromised one way or the other. It doesn't matter. Point is that the collapses of these 3 high-rises, according to the official narrative, are only driven by gravity. This is the official story. It's only driven by gravity. So, but due to these 2 or 3 stories are compromised to such an extent that at some point it cannot hold the upper section, and the upper section is crushing its way down the building. Now, there are fundamental laws of physics which implies that this is impossible. It's simply rubbish. But we don't need that. I'll show you here in the end a little video. It's David Chandler again, and it's very short. I'm finished in a few minutes. It's very short. And there are 4 observations to be made here in case you cannot hear the soundtrack. First, you'll see explosions on the west side of the building above the point of airline impact. And then the game is over, really, isn't it? Richard has already told us about that the top section on its way down does not fall to the ground. It poofs up in the open air. 2 observations now which you will do, and you'll understand why I had to tell you the nanothermite story first. You'll see an object moving to the ground faster than free fall. Can an object fall to the ground faster than free fall? No. But if you go up to Big Ben, and you fire a rocket down to the hot dog man, it will move faster than free fall. And you'll also see an object coming out of the South Tower, and then it makes a 90 degrees turn. It comes out like this, and then it goes that way. And then actually, it's what you call it. It doesn't go straight. It goes like this on this way. Things don't do that. It should have gone down there, but it comes out here, and then it goes that way. And then notice, you have seen this 100 of times, but you haven't thought about it before, that all the fragments being thrown out of the Twin Towers, they pull after them a complete homogeneous white smoke trail. Is this concrete? No. If you throw out a piece of concrete out of the window, it will not trace after it a completely homogeneous smoke trail. If you throw a piece of wallboard out of the window, will it pull after it a completely homogeneous smoke trail? No. This is an ongoing chemical reaction, and the other product from the thermite reaction, aluminum oxide, is white.
This is the destruction of the South Tower of the World Trade Center, viewed from a helicopter to the south. This particular video clip is rich in details that call the official story into question. Notice the numerous explosions on the west side of the building above the impact point. As the top 30-floor section falls, it tips to the east. It starts off intact, but then it disintegrates in midair. Gravity alone could not cause the top section to disintegrate. When an object is in free fall, there are no internal stresses. It should have hit the ground in one piece, but it didn't. Some of the debris is clearly being accelerated by forces other than gravity. These effects can be caused by late firing explosives, which can produce a white smoke trail. White smoke, consisting of aluminum oxide, is a byproduct of the thermite reaction. While producing this video, I ran across one rocket projectile I had not seen commented on before. This one stopped midair and changed directions. Even taking perspective effects into account, this projectile lost one component of momentum and gained another. That requires an impulse. Note that the rocket trail does not point back to the building, but the point where the impulse occurred. Let's take it from the top. There's a lot going on. Watch for the smoking guns.
The goddess of justice is usually depicted with a balance in her left hand and a sword in her right hand, and she's blindfolded. The meaning obviously be that we want our courts and the rule of law to operate only on hard forensic evidence, symbolized with the balance here. We want proofs, we want hard evidence. And the goddess Justitia, as we call her in Denmark, is supposed only to take care, to look at the balance. We scientists are very good at using balances. And we try to get our information in the same way, only counting on hard evidence. So justice is blind, science is blind, but we are not dumb. Thank you for your attention.